World War I ended November 11th, 1918, and less than 2 months later, Canada forced 4,200 conscripted men to set sail to Russia, not to fight the Germans, but to fight Russians, the Bolsheviks. It was a disaster. By this time, the 1910s, Canada is a democracy on paper, but in the 19th century, Canada was run by the family compact, the frat bro oligarchy, and by the 1910s, those same structures persisted. Power is still concentrated in a small, connected, Anglo-Protestant group of elites. The European empires were jockeying for power. Britain joined to keep Germany from overtaking its spot as Europe's top dog, right? And as part of the British Empire, Canada had to join. But we know that. A lot of the English-speaking parts of Canada felt loyalty to Britain, but French Canadians didn't see any reason to die for this cause, and I agree. They were resistant to conscription, just like the farmers were and a lot of people in the prairie, which led to protests and riots. In 1914, Borden promised and said that there would be no conscription, but by 1916-1917, Borden broke his promise. World War I also exposed global class tensions, including in Canada, culminating in the 1919 Winnipeg strike. Borden was an imperialist, loyal to Britain and the ruling class. Canada crushed strikes and aligned with the employers. In global politics, Canada sided with the whites in Russia, firmly against the Bolsheviks. And Borden did want Canada to prove itself, right, to Britain and to secure recognition onto the world stage. He was very focused on this legacy. And conscription, in his mind, was the best way to secure this legacy. And to do this, he postponed democracy to push conscription. He delayed the 1916 federal election and extended Parliament's term until 1917. He passed laws to rig the election. The Military Voters Act in 1917 allowed the ballots of soldiers overseas to be assigned to whichever riding the government chose, which effectively amplified the pro-conscription votes because obviously they wanted to be relieved. The Wartime Elections Act of 1917 enfranchised women, but only the women that were related to soldiers overseas, again, because they wanted their relatives to come home. And if you were an immigrant, like if you were Austro-Hungarian, if you were German, Ukrainian, and you weren't already put into an internment camp, which, by the way, 8,500 people were, he took your right to vote away if you had been here, even if you've been living here for 8-9 years, because many of them voted Liberal and Laurier was opposed to conscription. Okay, now that we have the vibe, let's get into it. In 1917, Russia was a firm ally of Canada, and then the Russian Revolution kicks off, and the Bolsheviks seize power in November 1917. Canada, the government, and the Allies refused to recognize the new Bolshevik government. The Canadians, however, the workers specifically, sided obviously with the Bolsheviks. Borden, in typical Canadian Prime Minister behavior, took this as a threat and appointed people to investigate Bolshevik influences in Canada. The Bolsheviks invited all warring nations to a peace conference, and the Allies, including Canada, ignored them and signed a separate treaty. Russia is now an enemy of Canada. In Vladivostok, there are 700,000 tons of Allied war material stockpiled on the wharves, and shockingly, the rich Canadians and Allies were like, God, we gotta send some poor people to go protect our resources. The Russian opposition to the Bolsheviks are the whites. The military brass told Borden straight up, warned him not to go to Russia, but in a private council, Borden approved the Siberian Force, and 4,209 men and 1 woman were approved to go to Russia. The Siberian Force mobilized as the Spanish flu hit Canada. That killed 60 million people worldwide, and as the Siberian troop trains were going across Canada to Vancouver, it has been proven by hospital records that this train coincides with the Western outbreak in Canada. So great job, Borden. They all arrive to Vancouver a couple weeks before the end of the war, and then the armistice is signed, and Canadians become pissed about the Siberian expedition, which led to a mutiny among the soldiers as they were being rounded up to board the ship in Victoria. O'Neill Boisvert was conscripted in the summer of 1918, and he and other soldiers started to attend labor protest meetings, and when he was asked to volunteer to go to Siberia, he was like, no, I gotta get back home, I'm a farmer. And instead, Boisvert and 300 other conscripts sent a desperate telegram to Ottawa begging not to be shipped to Russia, and Borden's response was like, too bad. On December 21st, 1918, they dragged Boisvert and the other French-Canadian conscripts out of their tents and told them to march 6 kilometers to Victoria's outer wharf. Halfway there, they were like, no, we're not going. And then Boisvert's feet were shot at. Boisvert just yelled back in French, we're not going to Siberia. So Swift had the great idea of having the obedient forces, the the ones from Ontario, Kingston and Toronto, take off their canvas belts and whip their own comrades back into line. And they did. It took 23 hours to drive the 259th Battalion into the SS Tista, bayonets at their back. Boisvert and a dozen ringleaders were thrown into the hold in handcuffs. No showers, no clean clothes, nothing for 38 straight days. Then a court-martial sentenced Boisvert to 2 years hard labor for joining in mutiny while on active duty in His Majesty's Armed Forces. Boisvert and the 259th were sent to Vladivostok anyway. The Canadians spent the winter and spring in 1919 essentially doing nothing in Vladivostok. They showed up right as a typhoid epidemic hit, so Elmsley and the brass were like, you're not going to be hanging out with the locals, you're not going to be going to the cinema or the cafes, taking tram rides, you're going to sit around and rot. Meanwhile, human misery was literally piled up at the train stations. Refugees had poured in from all over Russia, riding the Trans-Siberian straight to the end of the line with nowhere else to go. They camped inside the stations in the boxcars, wherever they could. Soldiers remembered patching up guys who were annihilated themselves in a house of ill fame, whatever that politely means. And one guy even watched as a thief from a bank robbery ran out and was shot in the head right in front of him, and then his body was just tossed onto a pile of other frozen bodies. The fighting between the White and Red Army was happening up north, about 4,300 kilometers up north, and most of the Canadians didn't go up there, where Kolchak's White Army was fighting the Reds in the mountains. But on December 8th, 1918, 55 of them, led by Elmsley from Montreal, left Vladivostok and traveled that 4,300 kilometer trek to Omsk and showed up right after a Bolshevik uprising had been crushed using unnecessarily harsh measures. The Bolsheviks had stormed a local prison and armed the inmates, seized the rail station, and blew up part of a bridge, and then the Whites answered by rounding up 200 suspects, put them on a frozen lake, and then shot them all. This obviously pissed off the locals, and then the British were like, hey, yeah, we're going to bring up all of the rest of the conscripts that are down in Vladivostok. This is where we are going to set up our base. And Elmsley's standing there like looking at all the locals who are sharpening their knives after watching their loved ones be massacred, and is like, I don't know, maybe we should get the hell out of here. And Britain's like, no, it's safe here, just as safe here as anywhere. But even in Vladivostok, the locals were getting fed up. Just like conscription split up Canada, forced service tore apart the relationship between the people of Primorsky and the white Russian government. It wasn't even just the Reds. Regular peasants were furious at the atrocities the whites were pulling, and they started forming partisan guerrilla bands. Then the white governor locked up Vladivostok's mayor, who wasn't even a Bolshevik, and that was it. The locals were done. Partisans took over Shakotovo, a town 50 kilometers out, and they cut off Vladivostok from coal and choked the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was the Allies' main line of communication. 200 Canadians were rushed to push them back, but by the time they got close, the guerrillas had already pulled up into the hills. Right in the middle of all of this, Shevchenko, who was the farmer turned partisan commander, sent out a proclamation to the Allies daring them to come at him. He said, "We demand that you evacuate our territory and go back from where you came. Just as the Allied troops left Odessa, so also will you be forced to leave Vladivostok. Until that time, we will never lay down our arms." By this time, the whole thing's collapsing in Canada and at home. Canada's 4 biggest labor councils went on the record saying that they were firmly against the Siberian expedition. Farmers groups joined in. The business press, the Herald, the Spectator, were all asking, why the hell are we in Russia? In March, MP for Montreal's St. Mary riding called the Siberian expedition a crime. Another Quebec MP, Tobin, straight up asked the defense minister, under what laws were the conscripts shipped to Siberia? Who gave that authority? With the legality of the whole mission in question, Elmsley quietly let the Quebecers, those mutineers, Boisvert, off the hook, pardon them. Then came the evacuation order. By May to June 1919, the majority, if not all, Canadians left Russia and returned home. And because of the social unrest, a lot of people sort of just forgot about the Siberian expedition because of, like, the Winnipeg General Strike, for example. But 19 Canadians died in Russia, most of them from pneumonia or other sicknesses. One officer, Lieutenant Thring, shot himself in the head 2 months before they left, and the whites lost anyway, and Canada didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1942.